All right, well, let's go ahead and get started because I think it is time. So good afternoon, everybody, or if you're in the Americas, good morning. Today we're going to talk about Sass, and specifically all of those parts that are the less common, less utilized part of Sass that you may or may not already know about, but that are extremely powerful for making some really robust style sheets. If you have any questions during the talk, feel free to ask them in Slack. I have it open and I will look at it periodically. So don't hesitate to put your questions as we're talking about it, especially if they're about the code that I'm showing, because it's a whole lot easier to talk about it right now when we're looking at it than trying to go back to it at the end of the session. All the code that I'm showing, I will make sure to have available online. It's on GitHub. I'll give you the link at the top at the end of the talk. That way, no need to take 50 screenshots or whatever. I will give you the code so that you guys can play with it on your own and see how it works. I got a funny story on how I got started with Sass is I actually used to really not like Sass. I was a less person, and adamantly so, because I was not a Ruby person and none of my projects had Ruby on it. Well, that's no longer actually the case. Now it runs on Node just fine. And it's worth knowing the difference between the two. A lot of the features we're talking about today are in Dart Sass, which is kind of the latest, newest version. If you're still running an older version of Ruby Sass, it won't work. A lot of these are kind of available in the later versions, not so much the older ones. Worth noting that I believe that at this point the Ruby one is deprecated as well. So always worth moving up since it's no longer going to be supported at some point, probably soon. So what is Sass anyway? And Sass is technically stands for Syntactically Awesome Stylesheets. I think we can all agree that they are indeed awesome. And what it is essentially it's a style sheet language that is compiled to CSS. Yeah, it allows you to use variables, nested rules, mixins, functions, and more, all with a fully CSS compatible syntax. So that's the really cool thing about Sass is that even if you don't use the full breadth of Sass, you can write just normal CSS in it and it will work just fine. However, it has a lot more. One of the very common narratives I often see on Twitter is that at this point Sass is dead because Sass basically has the same features as what the newer features coming out with CSS are, and we're going to get rid of it soon. There's no point in continuing with it, yada, yada. And it's not everybody who says that, but I've seen it a couple times, and I hope that this presentation will show you that no, Sass is not dead and can do a whole lot more than just CSS alone. So there's two syntaxes when you're using Sass. One is the SCSS syntax, which has brackets and semicolon, looks a lot like CSS. The other one is the indented syntax, and that one is a lot simpler and cleaner in the sense that none of the brackets are there, none of your semicolons are there. However, it's a lot more white space sensitive. Today, because it looks a lot more like CSS, I'm going to use SCSS, which is generally what I use in my day-to-day life anyway, but it has the advantage of looking a lot like CSS. And so if you're not familiar with Sass, hopefully it will help with following along and making it look a little bit more familiar for you. One of the big things that most people know in Sass is the ability to nest. So the ability to nest code is really cool because it allows us to very clearly indicate what our block of code really looks like. So what happens with that is you essentially have your instead of having to say input and then your class and then your class values, or input and then invalid and input and hover, you can all stick that in one large block that is nested within each other. That's where you get into things like the ampersand. So see how this class invalid has the ampersand at the beginning of it. That refers back to its parent. So the parent in this case is input. It's the overarching grouping. And so in this case, it would be one input pseudoclass invalid. We have a color of danger and a border, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what the ampersand is there for. It tells you that it's a reference back to the parent inside of the group. Over here, we also have the arrow referencing to the paragraph tag underneath. And in this particular case, it's a paragraph tag saying that, hey, any dot error after an invalid input, go ahead and show the error. You can also do this for hover and focus. It's very, very convenient for that because it very clearly puts your general style and then your hover and focus together. Kind of an accessibility shout out over here. Anytime you do a hover, you probably want to do a focus as well, because that way your users, when they're tabbing through a form, for example, like in this example, can go ahead and get the same experience. But that allows you to keep those things nice and grouped. The downside to nesting is that it's very, very easy to want to nest everything. So if you're talking about, for example, a list inside of a navigation tag, it's very easy to say, I have my nav, inside of which I nest my UL, inside of which I nest my LI, inside of which I nest my anchor tag. Probably not necessary, but then if you look at the exported code in CSS, that ends up being navul lia for every single time. So that becomes very, very specific very, very quickly. The problem with that level of specificity is the more you nest, the more specific you get, the more trying to override or tweak that style for a specific use case becomes difficult. And that's when we can get into some real problems. And you will see a number of people that don't like nesting specifically because you see so much of that infinite Christmas tree nesting of doom that becomes very hard to override. If you find yourself nesting more than 2 or 3 deep and getting that really staunch Christmas tree, start thinking, is it really necessary? Where are some things that really don't need to be nested like that? Where can I flatten that tree? So back to our navigation example, nav-L, nav-Li, nav-UL, nav-A is more than plenty in terms of our nesting. We don't have to have them Christmas trees all within each other, and we can still get that nice grouping that we get out of nesting. The other big part that most people are familiar with in terms of Sass is variables. And that's one of the things that was very popular, made it kind of popular very early. Now we also have custom properties in CSS, and that's one of the arguments for people saying that Sass is dead in terms of having equivalent abilities. Well, the thing with Sass variables and custom properties is they really don't work the same. They have, in terms of their output, they're very, very different. Sass variables, which is that part that you see on the right over here in the dark with the dark blue background, are all compiled down to their values. So when the Sass is compiled into its CSS output, you will see that the variable gets transformed into its value. On the other hand, with CSS, the value stays a variable. So that has the advantage that no matter what, you can change that variable value dynamically, and it will go ahead and change everywhere that you go ahead and reference that variable. In Sass, that's not possible because, again, that value gets changed at compile time to whatever the value of the variable is. So you get, in terms of theming, there's a lot of differences on how these can be used. If we go for the concept of a dark theme, for example, if we go ahead and have that the variables for our primary to be dark blue versus light blue in a dark theme, then we can go ahead and say our button, no matter what, has a background of primary. We're reassigning based on whether or not you have a class of dark. It works great. In Sass, you can't do that because that value gets assigned at compile time. So you do have to go ahead and write it out for both cases. The cool thing though is you can totally use both of these together to achieve a really cool and very, very powerful outlook, because what you get is you get the benefit of being able to assign your colors to variables and all of those things we love to assign to variables, all of those values we don't want to remember. Okay, I don't know about you, but remembering hex colors for what my theme colors are is not exactly at the top of my mind 90% of the time. So I do love to put those in variables. And same with what is my border radius or padding for certain things. I do a lot of those things in variables. Those can then be assigned to actual CSS variables and then saved in order for them to maintain that variable aspect and to be able to achieve kind of the same results and still have the full benefits of both sides. Now, what you'll notice on that Sass side on the right on the left, I mean, with the white background, you'll see that you have curly braces around my CSS variable. And what that is just simple interpolation. If we were to just assign $primary and not put that pound bracket around it, it would literally, as a variable, be assigned as $primary. It would take the actual string and plop it right in there, which obviously isn't legit CSS. It won't work. It won't do anything. What the pound brackets does is it takes the value of that element and sticks it in there instead of the actual string. There's a number of places where you have to do that. I'll point them out here and there. But that's how you get the value in order not to just assign when you're trying to assign a variable. Any questions so far? Go with no, since Slack is being really quiet. Okay. So what we're going to do is a lot of the examples we're going to look at going forward are based on this layout. 3 cards, coffee, cupcake, and bacon, because these are a few of my favorite things. And so what we're going to do is basically restyle this to be a little less boring than simple gray, black, and white, because that's kind of boring. The HTML for these cards is going to be the same for all 3. You're going to have a container div with the class of whatever is part of that card. So whether it's coffee, cupcake, or bacon, it's going to have a header, which is going to be an H2 with a header class. It's content with a class of content, and the button at the bottom with a class of actions. Pretty straightforward. All 3 cards are done exactly the same, just a different class at the top. Coffee, cupcake versus bacon. So in the more advanced stuff in CSS, the first thing I always love to show is mixins, because mixins are incredibly powerful. And mixins are kind of like a function in a lot of way, and they spit out a rule set. So what happens with the mixin is you basically say, I'm creating a mixin, that's the @mixin. Then you give it a name. In this case, I'm going to call it card colors. And then you pass it in a value. You don't have to pass it in a parameter, but in this case, I'm going to, because that's what they're really good for, and that's what they're really powerful for. And so in this case, it's going to be expecting a color. So I called my parameter my color. And I'm going to say, hey, with this mixin, I want you to take the header of whatever I assign this mixin to and give it a background color, that header a background of whatever color I passed in. The way we assign that to our cards is I go to say, okay, coffee, I want you to include this mixin. That's how so you've got your, wrong way. You've got your definition, which is the @mixin. The way you implement it is with @include. And so you @include the name of the mixin, and then and you pass in whatever parameters you're going to pass in. In this case, for coffee, I'm passing in cat blue, for cupcake plum, and for bacon gold. So these are all CSS color names. I figured that was a little bit nicer to talk through than hex codes. So what that's going to do is I'm going to say basically I want coffee to have a header that has a background of cat blue, cupcake a background of plum, and bacon a header background of gold. What that looks like on the output is super simple. It's exactly what we thought it was going to do, right? It's going to take that header, so .coffee.header, and same down the line, giving it a background color. What that looks like in our little UI is 3 beautiful little cards with 3 beautiful little backgrounds. Cool, that's exactly what we were expecting. Now you'll notice in these cards that I showed you this code, that's not near enough code to style these cards this way. There's a lot more code that went into styling these cards in terms of getting them to lay out, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I did not put that in my mixin. I simply put the part that was dynamic. And the reason for that is that a mixin basically takes all of that code that's in that mixin, all that if you put static code on it, all of that static code, it'll go ahead and assign any variables you have and plops it into that rule set that you created. That allows for, if you're using static values there, what happens is you're basically duplicating that code every time you use that mixin. Mixins are great for dynamic stuff. They are not good for static stuff. If we're dealing with static, we want to use that extend. And what that does is it takes a class that you've already written and it basically assigns whatever the class name is or whatever also to that class. So let's look at how that works. Let's say I put all of the code in the mixin. So this is all of the code you would need to style the card. Don't bother trying to read it. The point is to show you that it's a lot of it and that it's long and laborious and that we don't want to duplicate it. What the values are doesn't really matter at this particular point in time. So let's say I go ahead and make my mixin called card and I go ahead and include it with all of its glory. What happens is for each of our cards for coffee, cupcake, and bacon, we get that entire chunk of code. So we end up with it 3 times. If we have more cards, we get it as many times as we have cards. That's really laborious, really extensive, and it's going to bloat our CSS very, very quickly. If we instead go ahead and use the add includes, instead of defining that static code as a mixin, we just define it as a standard CSS class. We go ahead and say, you know what, coffee, cupcake, and bacon, I want you to extend that class. And so what happens is .card is still a class, so it stays around. And then bacon, cupcake, and coffee are also assigned to its value. And so now what you have is instead of duplicating it 3 times, you're just keeping it once and assigning those class names or those rule set names to whatever that class was as well. And so that allows you to keep the consistency across everything and not bloat your code. So mixins, great for dynamic code. Extend, great for static code. Because extend is just making a reference back to a different class, right? You can't pass any parameters or do any, like you could do logic in it, but you can't pass any parameters. Does that make sense to everybody? Functions. Color functions are the bomb. And there's a lot of them. I listed them out here. I'm not going to go through each and every color function and what they do because that would be boring and you guys can read a spec like the best of them. But I am going to use some here and there as we're talking through examples because they're super awesome and that is one of the things that it can do that CSS can't do. So color functions, usually what they have is they have a name and they take in parameters. What I'm going to show you in this one is the complement one because it's not as straightforward as some of the others. What happens with the complement one is it looks at the color wheel and it takes the color that is straight across it in the color wheel. So it's going to look at a color pair and go straight across the wheel. So say if we start with orange, if we pass in orange, it's going to return blue because it's straight across. If I pass in red, it's going to return green. Again, straight across the color wheel. What you will notice with color functions is a lot of them are very, very closely tied to things around the color wheel. So if you're not familiar with color theory, I would highly recommend looking into that. It will be very, very helpful in terms of understanding why and how they work and also why they're named the way they are. It's not necessary to understand and use them, but it will greatly help you in that endeavor. So going back to our function and using complement. So what we're going to do is our header's nice and pretty, but our button at the bottom was still gray and kind of boring. So we're going to go ahead and assign it complement. We take the color that we pass in, we pass it through the complement function, and poof, we have a different color button at the bottom. So Coffee is that blue color. Its complement is kind of a brown. Cupcake is kind of is plum. That complement is kind of green. And gold for our bacon has a complement which is almost just straight up CSS blue. The problem with that, though, is if we look at that a little bit more closely, the accessibility on that is pretty bad, and that's pretty unreadable. So let's go ahead and in Sass, purely in Sass, write some logic to try to prevent that accessibility problem. Starting to look a lot more like JavaScript here very quickly. So I'm going to take my Mixin and I'm going to expand upon it. And I'm going to say, you know what, that button at the bottom, I'm going to start with a button color of white. And then I'm going to take that complement background. We already had that before. But while the contrast doesn't pass, so while my contrast checker is equal to false, I want to darken the button text by 1% and keep looping until that contrast passes. So there's a lot to unpack in this function. If we look at just the button part of it, we've got button text. We're assigning that a color of white. Great. That's pretty straightforward. We've got our background. We've already dealt with that. Let's look at this while loop a little bit closely, because that's where it starts getting really interesting. Yeah, we have our complement color. We did that. We have our color function. Darken basically all it does is it takes the amount of black in a color and increases it until you get to whatever you want to be and based on a percentage. And then we have our while loop. So this is our while function, and a while function works very similar to any other language that you might be writing it. Basically, while the condition inside the parentheses is resolves, it continues to do its thing. So in our case, while our color contrast doesn't pass, so is equal to false, it goes ahead and darkens the button color. So the way they're constructed is you've got inside we have our function, we have the condition, and let's talk about conditions really quick. Conditions are, again, very similar to other languages, except if you're used to JavaScript. A lot of you, I'm guessing, do write a decent amount of JavaScript. And so we don't have triple equals in Sass. We just have double equals. The mathematical values are going to be very similar to other languages. Keep in mind, though, that especially for percent, the divided versus percent, because they actually use the divided sign, that can work for division, but it will also sometimes resolve as a unit, depending on the function that you're using. So sometimes that can mean divided, sometimes that can be percentage based on the situation. Got greater than and less than, those are pretty self-explanatory. Boolean behavior and or and not, there's no double ampersands, there's no pipes, you actually spell out the word. That tripped me up for quite some time because you actually have to spell it. You can concatenate strings just like in most other languages by using plus, dash, or slash. The big thing, though, if you're a JavaScript person to remember is that unlike JavaScript, Sass considers every value to be true except for false and null. So if it empty strings, zeros, those sorts of things are actually considered to be true in Sass. So if you're doing a Boolean check on anything, keep that in mind. Literally the only things that are ever considered false are false and null. So let's go back to our function. We've got our while rule, we've got this function, and we've got our condition. And how do we write Sass functions? Because last I checked, functions didn't exactly exist in CSS. Well, just like most things, we have to define it, and the syntax is going to look very similar to the syntax that you're going to see in other languages. You're going to start it with the at function. That's going to tell Sass what in the world you're doing. Then you're going to give it a name. You're going to pass in as many parameters as you want, and then you're going to have a return. You have to have a return in a function. Mixins worked very similarly, but they implicitly return whatever class, whatever rule set you're sticking in it. The difference between a mixin and a function is that a mixin will return a rule set, A function will return whatever that return value that you assign is, not necessarily a rule set. And probably doesn't work great for rule set. It works great for I'm trying to return a singular value. So we're going to take this beautiful, beautiful function that I stole straight out of the WCAGs, out of the W3 spec for color contrast. And what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that that our color contrast passes on our button. This is not the full-blown like ratio luminosity check that you would generally do. This is a simplified version. If we really wanted to use this, there's a little bit more math to do, but I wanted to show the concept more than how you calculate color contrast. I do have some accessibility talks if anybody's interested, but since this is about Sass, I figured I'd simplify it and focus on the Sass concepts. So what we're going to do is we have our function, we have our function name, we go ahead and give it our parameters, which are our text color and our background color. And then we go ahead and calculate our red, green, and B value, sum them up, and sum them up. So over here we have some color functions. We have red, green, and blue. What those are is they take a color, any color, and return the amount of red, green, and blue respectively that whatever color you passed in is going to have. Super convenient for our current use case. The other part that you'll see is some math functions. You've got that max and that min. Sass has a buttload of those. Again, I'm not going to run through them for the same reason as the color functions. That would get boring very, very quickly. But you have a slew of them, max and min being exactly what you think it's going to give you. Max is going to give you the bigger value of the two, min is going to return the smaller value of the two. And so then we got to have a return, right? Because our function right here does not have a return yet. And we said earlier that functions have to have a return. Our return is going to, if you remember the expression from earlier, is either going to return true or false. We pass or we don't pass. So we're going to write an if statement because you can do that in Sass. At if, you get an expression, and you can even get really fancy with it and do an at else. You don't have to, but it is definitely there. We're going to use an if else. Keep in mind if you're used to JavaScript, it doesn't take parentheses around that expression. So remember that gets a little weird looking at if you're really used to JavaScript. And actually I have them in there, which is glorious, at the first level. So it might actually work. I'd have to double check that with the code to see if it's a typo or not. Anywho, so we're going to say, okay, let's look at the bottom if else block first. And we're going to say, hey, if our sum is less than 400, that number is based on the color, basically the color difference between the two. It's not exact, but it will work most of the time. So that's where I kind of put the stop. If I were to use this in production, or I would definitely want to fine tune it. But basically, if the difference in our colors is less than 400, I want you to return false, and so that our while loop can keep going. Otherwise, return true. Our color is good enough. Notice at the top I have an other if. We started with our button color of white. And so what I want to do with that is make sure that if we ever get to black, something went terribly awry, because we've ran through the entire gamut from white to gray and still haven't found a color that passes color contrast. There's a problem there. There's going to be a color there's going to be a gray value that actually passes. So something went terribly wrong. So this prevents it from spinning completely out of control. The other way I could have done that is there's actually a way in, so this will prevent it from failing and keep the compilation going. There is actually an at error you can throw if you want it to actually throw an error and stop the compilation. And what that will do is go ahead and print out whatever message you do in your console and tell you why it errored out. So those can be really, really convenient to be able to tell you what's going on in your application. We have now our returns, those mandatory returns we were talking about. And we can look at our full function together with our while. So now we know we've got our while, we've got our contrast checker, we've got our false, and we go ahead and do our thing. And so now when we spit it out, it does spit out a beautiful color on each of them. So we have coffee ends up with a background color of white, cupcake ends up with the 2E, 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 and bacon ends up with white as well. And now our accessibility is significantly nicer and we can actually read that text. Now we did some really fancy schmancy math on all of that, and there's a lot of ways in which we could have typoed something or we could have done something wrong, and it kind of feels black box-ish, right? So there's this beautiful thing called @debug. It's the Sass equivalent of JavaScript's console.log. And what it does is whatever you spit in there, it goes ahead and spits out for you in your console wherever you're running that Sass. In this case, I was just running Node Sass directly on my system, so you can see my console output. It tells me which file my bug is in, which line number it's at, and whatever I told it to spit out. So in this case, my text color plus my background color equals whatever that number was, that sum was. But you can make it spit out whatever you want. And you can totally chain strings and do all that fun stuff if you want. So we still have our 3 cards, coffee, cupcake, and bacon. But we're realistically writing the same thing 3 times, right? We're writing @extend every time, @include every time, and just passing it a color. Could we get even lazier about it and just write it once? Absolutely. We can use an @each. And what @each does, there's 2 different syntaxes for it. This first one just takes a series of values, and for each value in that series of values does stuff, whatever you want it to. The other option is to do a key value pair. So very similar to what you would have in an array, like an array of objects, for example, where you can go ahead and reference not only the key, but whatever those value in that list is going to be. We're going to use that second syntax because we not only want to know which card we're dealing with, but we also want to know which color is our initial color. So what we're going to do is say, back to the very beginning where we had that cadet blue, plum, and gold for each of them, we're going to do coffee, cadet blue, cupcake, plum, and bacon, gold. And we're going to pass that through our for each. So our key is essentially our selector, and then we have our color as part of our cards. Now I pass in .coffee because maybe next time I want to do that on something that has an ID as a selector, or maybe next time I want to do that as on an element instead of simply on a class. So that allows me a lot of versatility, and that is one of those use cases where I have to use that interpolation that we talked about at the beginning of the session, where you have the pound bracket pound. Otherwise it would literally just print out selector as my variable, and that wouldn't be very helpful. And so now what I can do is for each of the values in that cards variable, it's going to go ahead and do our thing and spit out the equivalent of what we were doing before. So let's look at the output. We still get our pretty output. So now with just a mixin and a function and an each, we get all of this pretty code that we can reuse throughout our application all over the place with extreme consistency, and with the ability to very, very easily update it, clean it up, exchange it, because everything is really controlled by that one source. That's where the real power of all this is you're controlling all of your code from one place, and you can keep that consistency throughout your app. But let's keep going. We've talked a lot about cards. What we also need is a navigation on our little wannabe app, right? So simple nav, nothing particularly glorious about it. We've got a nav tag, we've got a list, we've got list items, and inside of it we have links, right? We have 3 of them. One my favorite things, login and profile, because these seem like pretty standard links you would have. If you do download the code, they go to nowhere, but there you go. And for that, we're going to do a for loop because we want those links. They're really boring right now. They're standard, excuse me, browser default color. We want to make those pretty rainbow colors. because everything else about our application is rainbow colored. So let's go ahead and make this rainbow colored too. So we're going to iterate through our list by using an @for loop. And so for basically goes through from whatever that first number is to the second number. So for I, which is our iterator, from whatever number to whatever number, do stuff. There's kind of two syntaxes for it. You can do from through or from to. So from through is going to be inclusive. That's the top one. So if you say from 1 through 10, it's going to iterate with I equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. If you do the from to 10, it'll stop at 9. Does that make sense? Because you've got one of them, so the through is inclusive, to is exclusive. The other thing is how that iteration count, that iteration works all by itself. You don't have to increment the I. If that first number is smaller than the second number, it'll count up by ones. If that first number is larger than the second number, it'll decrement by 1, and it will do that increment and decrement for you, which is really cool. So let's go back to our color wheel and play with some color functions since we're playing with the rainbow. And what we're going to do is we're going to say we've got 3 of them. So we're going to make we're going to base it on the triad, which basically splits the color wheel in 3. Circle is 360 degrees, divided by 3 is 120 degrees. That's where we're going to rotate it. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that for loop. We're going to start with the base color of whatever random green, and we're going to iterate 1 through 3 because we have 3 nav items, right? And the type I, which is going to iterate 1 through 3. And we're going to change the link color to be adjusted. So we're going to, that base color, we're going to rotate, which is what adjust hue does. It rotates you on the color wheel. So it keeps the same amount of white, the same amount of black in that color, and just changes what your hue is going to be, which is the color aspect of it. Keep in mind that you might be tempted to do this on the list coming in from some data. You can't do this and not know how many items are in your list. This is done at compile time, not at runtime. So you have to know ahead of time how many items you have. You can totally do some stuff like we could repeat this by doing nth of type with n plus or even odd, those sorts of things if we wanted to. However, you can't just say, I'm getting an unknown amount of data, I'm going to apply this based on the amount of data that I'm getting in, because it's being done at compile time, not at runtime. It's too late at that point to be able to do this. So that is one of the limitations. However, if you already know how many you have, if you're dealing with a static site, or if you're dealing with a nav bar, for example, such as in this case, we already know how many items we have. This is perfect. So we're going to go ahead and for each link, we're going to go ahead and adjust what that color is. So let's see what that looks like. What that looks like is super simple. We end up with our A link, A visited, whatever color rotated. Now notice that this starts on blue. And the reason it starts on blue and not on green, even though that was my base color, is because even at number 1, we've already rotated 120, right? We've already gone around the circle 120 degrees because 1 times 120 is 120 degrees. We could have put some kind of safeguard on it if we wanted to start on green, but that's okay. We go all the way around circle and circle back to it. That's perfectly fine as well. So what that gives us is our pretty nav bar with pretty rainbows. So I've thrown a lot at you during this talk, very quickly, I realize. What we've gone over is the SCSS syntax versus the indented syntax. Remember, that's the semicolon versus non-semicolon stuff, and bracket versus not. Nesting, beware of your Christmas trees. Cross-sum properties versus variables and how those work together. That interpolation piece in order to get the value out of something. Color functions, we didn't go through all of them, but we went through a number of them. Operators, beware that they don't work like JavaScript, right? Null versus false being the only things that are false. Empty strings and zeros being true, unlike JavaScript. Some math functions, and then the really important bits, which are your at rules. So your at mixin, at extend. So the mixins being really, really good for dynamic content, at extend being great for static, while function, if else, each for, and debug, which is debug being our console log. So as promised, if you want to find the code to be able to run this yourself, here's the link. I'll leave this up for a couple seconds, and I will take any questions anybody has. So we're looking at trying to share our SCSS variables with our JS. Do you have any recommended way to do that? Are you meaning to share your SCSS variables across files? Like across various SCSS files or into the actual JS itself? Like for the JS to assign the Sass variables? I have never tried to cross-pollinate that way. So I do not actually have a recommendation for that. I am really not sure. Cool. And I apologize if I mispronounced your name. Helder says that he does it using Webpack. Anybody else? When you had the loop with keys and value, if you wanted more than one value like supply, primary, and second, how would I go about doing that? Okay, so let's pull up that slide really quick. So that would be this one, maybe? There we go. The mapping in Sass is pretty limited. It's not quite as versatile as, say, doing a full-blown object like in JavaScript. Let me double check something really quick. What you can do is basically you can destructure it in a way that basically you would have, instead of value, like value 1 equals basically all 3 of your items. Value 2 equals all 3 of your items, the same way as this top part. And that way you can then make a third list of the values of values. And then you can iterate not only around your value of values, but then around those values. So you probably want to nest those properties. Does that make any sort of sense? So you would end up with, right, because it doesn't really have a strict context. The other thing you can do is you can say, icon, like, yeah, that's, you can say values. You could say, for example, values, and I'm going to try to use something concrete. I'm going to use like animals and their types, because that makes more sense than random foo and bars. But what you could totally do is say animals colon cat furry cute, comma, you know, dog slobbery also cute, comma. And that you can string multiple. So between your columns are those, between your commas are each separation. So you can make lists of lists if you want to shorthand it. That's the other ways you could put those together. I personally would probably lean towards assigning each kind of list to a variable simply because of readability. But you definitely don't have to. You can string that all the way in line if you want to. This might be out of scope, but do you know how to activate which extension to get code compilation IntelliSense when using SCSS and VS Code? Yes, I actually use VS Code, so let me tell you what I use. Let's see. So the way I compile stuff is I just run the dumb watcher in the console. The one that's right there on the front page, like I have it installed on my machine. Do I have anything specific for Sass in here? Sass, if you type in Sass in terms of extensions, there are a number of them specifically for indentation and syntax highlighting. The only thing I use is I use Beautify for being able to clean up my files when my indentation gets wonky, but the actual syntax highlighting, it looks like the theme I am using is doing it by default. I'm doing a pretty good job by default, so I don't seem to have anything specific to Sass installed related to that. And the theme I am using is One Monakai theme by Joshua Asimov. So it seems to be doing it all by its onesies without any extra help. Any other questions? Are your slides available anywhere? Yes, my slides are published on martine.dev. If you go under publications, all of my slides for all of my talks are there. So martine.dev. Cool. Well, if nobody has any other questions, oh, which naming convention do you feel works best with Sass? That's solely and strictly up to you. Honestly, what I highly recommend is not necessarily a strict box or one is better than the next or one is better than the other. Is to make a team agreement with whoever you're working with and make sure you're being consistent. I generally name things lowercase and dashed much more and based on what they're used for rather than what they do. So I'm going to say, instead of saying, like, I'm never going to call a class danger background, I would call it, error, for example. But I think the more important than how you go about your specific naming is whatever your team is comfortable with and whatever is for you guys to agree on what works for you. Because even different projects, you might have different needs in terms of that, or some projects might work better one way versus another. So think that's a discussion with the other devs on your team to come up with whatever works for you guys and agree to it and stick to it. That's the important bit, more so than what syntax you're going to use. So very similar to just standard CSS on that. Do you have a chance to work with Tailwind? I have not worked with Tailwind, so I cannot give you any like better or worse difference of any kind because I've never worked with Tailwind before. Cool. Well, I will be around on Slack. I'm gonna surrender the room for the next person, but I will be available, you know, just generally through Slack. You can DM me or in the hallway track or whatever. Thank you everybody for coming. And I hope you guys I'll flash the code the QR code for where to find the code for this presentation one last time. If anybody missed it, and hope you guys have a wonderful day. Thank you.